Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Philosophy Sharing Foundation, we are glad to welcome you here this evening for this event, which forms part of the annual philosophy lecture which Philosophy Sharing Foundation holds every year. Unfortunately, for the last 2 years, this event was cancelled because we all know of the pandemic, COVID-19. In fact, tonight's speaker, Professor Peter Singer, was supposed to come to Malta in 2020, 2 years ago, but unfortunately this could not take place. However, today we have Professor Singer with us, who will be sharing his ideas with us on important philosophical issues. Philosophy Sharing Foundation is a foundation which was set up 10 years ago. In fact, this year we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the founding of Philosophy Sharing Foundation. It was on the 21st of May, 2012, when this foundation was set up by a public deed, and the motor behind this foundation was our dear philosopher, Father Peter Serracino-Nglot, who was instrumental in having this foundation set up. In fact, he was the inspirator, if you want, who brought together both academic philosophers and philosophy enthusiasts to form this foundation. In fact, we try to hold the annual philosophy lecture near the date of his demise, namely on the 16th of March. Father Peter passed away on the 16th of March, 2012. So we have obviously always Father Peter in mind when we have these celebrations. Philosophy Sharing Foundation holds monthly lectures on different philosophical themes, and the annual lecture, which we try to bring over an important speaker to give us an academic lecture, and therefore this year we are very lucky and honored to have with us Professor Peter Singer. Together with Professor Singer, we have also Professor Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, who is a Polish utilitarian philosopher, who will also be giving us a talk after the break. So I'll pass on the mic to Professor Claude Manjon, who will be introducing the speakers and the themes for this evening's lecture. Thank you.
It's with great pleasure that we have Professor Singer and Professor Lazari-Radek with us to share their ideas. Today's topic is called Aiming for the Best Consequences, a Case for Utilitarianism. So the focus of today's talk is on utilitarianism. I'll just briefly say something about both of our speakers so that we can listen to their ideas. Professor Singer lectures at the University of Melbourne and is a professor of ethics at the both theoretical and practical level. He is probably better known for his defense of animal rights and animal ethics, but he's also very committed to issues of global poverty and climate change. And in fact, tomorrow's foundation talk will be on animal ethics and global poverty. His academic output is extensive, and some of his publications include Why Vegan?, The Life You Can Save, How to Do Your Part to End World Poverty, and obviously one of his earlier texts called Animal Liberation. For those of you among the audience who are interested in more information on his projects and publications, he has a website, petersinger.info, and if you're also interested in questions of global poverty, there's a website which is called youcansave.org. It's not by chance that both our speakers are here together. They've been collaborating on a number of projects and book projects for a number of years. The most recent one, as far as I know, is the one on utilitarianism. It's called, in the Oxford series, called A Short Introduction to, in this case, Utilitarianism. And they've also collaborated together on another text called The Point of View of the Universe, Sedgwick and Contemporary Ethics. And I probably think it's a safe bet to say that they both have a common interest and admiration for Henry Sedgwick, who is perhaps the most underrated of the classic utilitarian figures. Professor Lazari-Radek lectures at the University of Lodz, and she's a professor of ethics. She also lectures with Professor Singer at the European Graduate School, and you can follow their lectures. They have quite a number of lectures on YouTube. The focus of her research is utilitarianism, and in particular act utilitarianism, as opposed to rule utilitarianism. Her defense of act utilitarianism is based on the work of Henry Sedgwick, who's a familiar name, which she developed in her doctoral research called Good and Reason and the Moral Philosophy of Henry Sedgwick. Professor Lazari-Radek is also a prolific writer, and she publishes in her native Polish as well as in English on utilitarianism, bioethics, and the philosophy of children. And she's also translated into Polish Ben Freiberg's Habermas and Foucault, Thinkers for a Civil Society. Tonight's events will play out in the following way. First, Professor Singer will deliver his presentation, and then we'll be open for questions from the audience. At about 7, we'll stop for a brief coffee break, and then we'll listen to Professor Lazari-Radek's talk, and also followed by questions. One last thing is if you could make sure your mobiles are on silent mode so that we don't have this constant ringing in the middle of the presentations. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Check my own mobile first. Yeah, that's okay. Good. So I think I'll take this microphone and stand with it. I need this as well. Thank you very much, Claude, for that introduction. And I do want to thank everybody who's been involved in making it possible for me and Katarzyna to visit Malta. Both of us are here for the first time, and we're enjoying it very much. Valletta is a beautiful city. We've already seen that, and a very historic city. So I want to thank particularly Ian Rizzo, who's just leaving the room, but I hope will return, for very careful organization to make sure that everything was going to run smoothly. Max Kassar, of course, as he said, these plans go back to 2019, really. So it's wonderful that they have now come to fruition. So this is the topic, as you've heard, that we're going to be talking about. I'll be speaking for 20, 25 minutes, perhaps at the most. And I do want you to have time for discussion after that, because I know that utilitarianism and what I will be saying is a controversial topic, and I'd like to have a good discussion about some of those questions. But I'm going to set the scene for what utilitarianism is, where it fits in, how one might argue for it, again following Henry Sidgwick, as Claude mentioned, and also I'll briefly discuss a couple of objections to it. So let's go with that, and we'll start with what is utilitarianism, so we know what we are talking about. And the first thing to say is utilitarianism is one of a family of theories, or a genus, if you like, to the biological analogy of theories, which come under the broad heading of consequentialism. So if you're thinking about ethical theories in general, and I'm talking here about normative theories, that is, theories that tell us or guide us into what we ought to do, what is the right action, how ought we to live, it's those questions that these theories are intended to provide answers for, then you can really divide all of the available theories into consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories. More or less by definition, that's an exhaustive coverage. The consequentialist theories are the ones that satisfy this account here, that an action is right if its consequences are better than, or at least as good as, in the case of a tie, the consequences of any other action that the agent could have done. So the criterion of right and wrong depends on looking at the consequences of your action as compared with the consequences of other actions that you might have done. So this excludes, clearly, theories which say the right action is one that is in accordance with the following set of moral rules, whatever that set of moral rules might be, whether it's the Ten Commandments or some other modified set of rules, that is going to judge right and wrong by obedience to the rules, not the consequences. And even if you soften that in various ways, if you say, as some philosophers have, there are prima facie rules, but they're not absolute, then if what you're supposed to do is to somehow weigh up the extent to which you're violating those rules or the extent to which you're performing your prima facie duties, if you're still not ultimately concerned with the consequences, it won't be a consequentialist theory. And if you're concerned with whether your actions instantiate certain virtues in a virtue ethics model, that also is not going to be in itself a consequentialist theory. So that's the family or the genus, but it leaves open the question, what consequences really matter? How should we evaluate the consequences? And there are many possibilities here. For example, you might think that good consequences include maximizing freedom, or bringing about justice, or increasing knowledge, or living more virtuously, defined in some other way. Those would be consequentialist theories if what we are doing is saying we want to maximize the consequences, the best consequences, taking into account those varied goods. But utilitarianism differs from those theories, and that's why it's a specific form of consequentialism. And this is what I'll be talking about. So utilitarianism, although it certainly has precursors that go back a long way, you can debate, early utilitarian thinkers. The early Chinese thinker Mozi may have been broadly utilitarian, as far as we can tell from what we know of his works, and there are certainly others that emerge in the 17th and 18th century. You get writers thinking in more utilitarian terms, but essentially as a school of thought, as something that was made more specific and more precise, it comes from Jeremy Bentham, writing in the late 18th century and early 19th century, and from Bentham's disciple, in fact Bentham's godson, John Stuart Mill, and in the mid to later 19th century, and then, as Claude mentioned, Henry Sidgwick, who we do, both Katarzyna and I, regard as philosophically the most careful of the great 19th century utilitarians. It was Sidgwick who was really a professional philosopher in the modern sense. He spent his whole life really from being a student as an academic at Cambridge University. Whereas Bentham wrote on a great number of subjects and had no university position, and John Stuart Mill also did many different things in his life, wrote a great deal, but was not an academic, and some of his writing is not particularly careful, in contrast to Sidgwick's. So that's where the theory comes from, and utilitarianism is distinguished from the other consequentialist theories by saying that the only consequences that matter are those that affect the well-being of all of those affected. Now, of course, if you're familiar with Bentham's work, you will know the idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, which in some respects is a rather misleading statement of utilitarianism, because it gives you the impression that if 50% plus one of a population will be happier, then that's the right thing to do, which of course is certainly not going to be the case if they're only slightly happier and the 49.9% are utterly miserable. The greatest happiness, the greatest number is not what utilitarians are going to suggest. But it is the idea of happiness as against misery, or well-being more broadly, that the classical utilitarians understood as well-being, and they wanted to produce the greatest possible surplus of happiness or pleasure over suffering or pain. So Katarzyna is going to say more about values, the values and how we understand that, and defend the view that that is the kind of consequence that we should be looking at in order to talk about what is the right thing to do. I'm rather going to talk a little bit about how you might argue for this general view of maximizing well-being as a normative theory, and then, as I said, I'll talk a little bit about a couple of objections to that. Okay, so this is just a sort of summary what I've been saying before. One thing about utilitarianism that should be emphasized is it's a maximizing theory. It does tell you to aim to try to produce the most good, not just to say, you know, well, don't do bad things, not just to say produce a sufficient level of good. For example, live your life so that there'll be more good in the world rather than less. No, utilitarianism is saying you should be doing the most good that you can. You should be producing the greatest good. That's the criterion of the right action. As I said at the beginning, that the action you choose will produce better consequences than any other alternative. And that is going to lead to one of the objections that I want to talk about. Okay, but first, well, here finally is Henry Sidgwick, the philosopher we're talking about, and this is his major work, not his only work by any means, but certainly the work that is most read and studied of all the things that he's written, and that what we will be referring to, both Katarzyna and myself, is drawn from the Methods of Ethics, which is readily available both online and from libraries, and it's usually the 7th edition. That's one reason why Sidgwick was so careful, in that he, throughout his life, was first published in 1873, and the 7th edition was produced posthumously from notes that he had made in 1907. So it was a long period that he worked through revising and trying to perfect this work. So I'm drawing arguments particularly from Book 3. The Methods of Ethics has 4 books, as it's called, and Book 3 is the one that really contains the arguments for utilitarianism. Book 4 then develops more specifically what utilitarianism is, but I'll be looking particularly at that. And there's 2 steps in Sidgwick's argument for utilitarianism. The first step is, as I say, a critique of common sense morality. Now, by common sense morality, Sidgwick means to some extent, the generally accepted morality of his day. He also means things that we are likely to feel intuitively to be right, just, you know, at a sort of popular level of intuitionism, not as a philosophical project, but just in terms of everyday judgments. A large part of Book 3 is a critical analysis of common sense morality, in which he argues that the understanding of common sense morality that we have, and that the contemporary moral theorists of his time were defending, is in fact incomplete. And it's incomplete in two particular ways. One is a question of where are the boundaries of these principles, and the other is what do you do when two of the principles, because there are many principles in common sense morality, what do you do when two of them clash? So in terms of the boundaries, you can think about, for example, the duty or the principle of veracity, or in other words, truthfulness. So think about when is it wrong to lie, right? You probably think in general it is wrong to lie. In general you should tell the truth. But there are many exceptions that we recognize to that principle. Some of them are exceptions because we think the person who is asking us a question is not entitled to know the truth, perhaps. So Kant had a famous example that imagine that there is a murderer at large who is trying to kill an innocent person. The innocent person has come to your house and asked to be hidden from the murderer, so you hide the murderer somewhere in your house, and then the murderer knocks on your door and says, "Have you seen so-and-so, the intended victim?" Now Kant, who was absolutely not a consequentialist, said, even in these circumstances, you must not tell a lie. So suppose that the only thing that will really save your victim is if you tell the would-be murderer, "Ah, yes, I saw him, he was going that way, running down towards the market square," or something like that. That would convince the would-be murderer, we assume. Anything else, refusing to answer the question at all, for example, will just make the murderer suspicious that the victim is in your house, and he will search the house and kill him. Even so, Kant said, you can't tell a lie. Now, most people, I think, today would say, not only can you tell a lie, you should tell a lie if that's the way to save your victim's life. But where again are the boundaries of this? Okay, this seems a clear case, but suppose the harm that is likely to fall on the person is much less. Suppose the person is not going to do any killing or anything like that. When is it justified to tell a lie in these circumstances? And then there's another completely different kind of boundary that we have, and these would be rather trivial lies. So if somebody asks you to join them at a social event and actually you can't stand the idea of being with them at this social event, but you don't want to hurt their feelings, so you say, "Look, I'm very sorry, but I've got another engagement on that evening." Is that something that is wrong? Or is that something that actually is a good thing to do because it avoids offending people unnecessarily? If your partner asks what you think of the new clothes that they've bought, and actually you don't like them, but it's not a big deal, is it wrong to say that you do like them? Is that a lie that you shouldn't tell? So there are all these questions about both boundaries, this, and then there are questions about the clash between the duty of veracity, of telling the truth, and let's say the duty not to harm people. And that's like in the murder case, where you would be harming somebody, even if indirectly, by telling the would-be murderer the truth. And Sidgwick's argument was that in these circumstances, the only way we can make decisions is by looking at the consequences of what we do. That in fact that's, even if we don't explicitly and openly acknowledge it that's what we're doing in these cases. We're balancing the harm of telling a lie with the greater harm of an innocent person being murdered. Or we're balancing the slight harm of causing somebody to be offended by knowing that you don't really want to keep them company on a particular occasion with the fact that you've told a lie about not really having a previous commitment. So Sidgwick's claim is that these principles, while they might work in many cases, in some of their central cases, they might be sufficient to guide us, they don't really have an underlying foundation, and that foundation can only come from the idea of utility. In other words, the idea of producing the best consequences for your action. So it's a critique of the morality of common sense as a sufficient account of what's right and wrong. Sidgwick doesn't necessarily deny that in most cases these rules will express some kind of developed historical wisdom about how to behave and how to have a society that functions reasonably well, but he just doesn't think that they're really telling you the whole story about morality and where it comes from. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. I think we could supplement Sidgwick today by saying not only is some of these rules the wisdom of past ages, but some of them may also actually have an evolutionary basis. Some of them may be something that enabled our ancestors to survive and reproduce in an earlier period, and not only reproduce, but have their children survive and reproduce themselves. And so we may have these intuitive responses to some things, but it's not necessary that these actually guide us properly today. So take, for example, the negative response we have to the idea of incest. That obviously could be something that led people not to inbreed, made more likely that you would have healthy offspring and healthy societies in an age where there was no contraception. But is it still wrong, nevertheless, for consenting adults, let's say a brother and sister, to have sexual relations? Most people still intuitively think, yuck, you wouldn't want to have sex with your brother or sister. But why exactly is that wrong? It's harder to say if you're not if you can be sure you're not going to have any children. Who does it harm, you might say? So, you know, there are questions at least that can be raised about the intuitions that we have and how reliable they are as forms of moral judgment. So I think that you know, supplementing Sidgwick's critique of some of these moral judgments is still a valid thing to do. Okay, secondly, having had this critique of common sense morality, Sidgwick then argued about how can we say that there is a case, a positive case, for the idea of maximizing well-being for everyone. And for Sidgwick, he thought that morality is a matter of truth or falsity. He was not a relativist or a subjectivist about morality. He thought that there are some underlying truths, even though descriptively societies may differ. And in particular, he thought that it's possible to take the point of view of the universe. This is, as Claude mentioned, the title of a book that Katarzyna and I wrote about Sidgwick and contemporary ethics, and we thought that this is a particularly significant phrase that Sidgwick uses. Now, you note that in this quote, he says, from the point of view, if I may say so, of the universe. Sidgwick did not himself believe that the universe has a point of view. Sidgwick seems to have been an agnostic about religion. He refused to state that he accepted the 39 Articles of the Church of England, which meant that he had to resign his lectureship at Cambridge University, as at that time that was a requirement for being a lecturer at the university. Fortunately, within a short time after Sidgwick publicly resigned, Parliament amended the legislation so that he could again be reinstated without saying that he'd believed in the 39 articles. But, so I don't think he thought the universe had a point of view, but it's an imaginary exercise. He's saying, just detach yourself from who you are here and now, detach yourself from that narrow point of view, and try to look at things from a universal point of view. And then Sidgwick argues, if we do that, we can say that the well-being of any one individual, so my well-being, is of no greater importance than Ian's there, or Claude's there, or any one of you in the audience, unless, this is the qualification, as I said, Sidgwick was a very careful philosopher, so he always qualified things. This is a rather typical Sidgwickian sentence with a semicolon and a qualification following the second half of it. So unless there are grounds for believing that more good is likely to be realized in one case than the other. So suppose somebody has a very limited capacity for experiencing happiness or misery. Maybe they've had some serious brain damage and can only barely in a dull way appreciate positive or negative experiences. So then Sidgwick would say, okay, well then somebody who has much greater capacity for happiness and suffering, their good would count for more, even from the point of view of the universe. But in general, we have no reason for believing that. We have no reason for believing that some people have greater capacities for happiness or misery than others. So we should assume really equality, that everybody's good is equal to everyone else's good. And that's a large part of the foundation for the impartiality or universal perspective that utilitarianism takes. And then Sidgwick also says, it's evident to me that as a rational being, I am bound to aim at good generally, so far as it is attainable by my efforts, not merely at a particular part of it. So what Sidgwick is saying here, that positions like egoism, which he discusses at length in the first book of the Methods, are ultimately not what a rational being would do. The egoist says, it's my interests that matter. The right action is the action that will maximize my well-being, not anyone else's, unless indirectly my well-being is linked with theirs. But Sidgwick says, no, this is not really what a rational being would do. A rational being could see that they are just one among a large number of beings in the universe, and that their well-being doesn't really count for more than anyone else's. So this is a contrast to many other views of rationality in action. For example, David Hume, the 18th century predecessor of Bentham and others, who thought that reason is dependent upon desire. That first you have a desire to achieve an end, which is not in itself rational or irrational, and then reason is just about showing you how to achieve that end, or perhaps how to balance that end and that desire with other desires you have. But Sidgwick has a stronger idea of the use of reason in action, and thinks that that's what a rational being should do. And again, as Katarzyna and I argue in the point of view of the universe, we think you can defend that also with a kind of evolutionary critique of narrower views, of, for example, egoism, or even of a social view that says you should do what's in the interest of members of your social group, but not impartially of others. Those positions, again, may have evolved in order to enable people to survive or enable social groups to be stronger and to flourish, whereas other social groups that did not have that sense of working for each other and limiting your interest to those others may not have survived. But the fact that this helped, helped our ancestors to survive and reproduce doesn't make it rational. Again, it might be that what helped them is not a rational thing to do, it's just the way evolution works. And if we think today, for instance, as I'll be arguing in the part of the talk I give tomorrow, should we be concerned about the well-being of non-human animals? Should we be concerned about the well-being of people on the other side of the world in low-income countries? I'm going to argue that the answer is yes, even though we might not have the same intuitive feeling that this really matters, or that it matters as much as helping people in our own community. So I agree with Sidgwick that if you think of this, try to detach yourself from those feelings, think of it as a rational argument, then we should be looking at good generally, not merely at a particular part of it. Okay, I don't want to go on too much longer, so let's look at just two objections. Here's a very famous objection that has been stated in different ways. I think this is the classic statement of it from Dostoevsky's brother Karamazov, a question that Ivan poses to Alyosha, where he says, basically he's saying, imagine that you could create a utopia on Earth forever, that would last forever. So there would be, we would all be happy in the end, we would be peace and rest, so imagine there's going to be no more wars, no more violence at home or anywhere else, we're all going to be able to live happily, and this will go on for the rest of the existence of our species. But in order to bring this about, you've got to torture this one child over there, torture them to death, in fact, just this one tiny creature. Would you consent to bring about that utopia? Ivan asks Alyosha, who says, no, I wouldn't. Well, we knew that Dostoevsky was not a utilitarian anyway, and the utilitarian answer to this is, look, this is a completely hypothetical situation. Dostoevsky never explains, or Ivan never explains, how exactly torturing one small child to death will bring about utopia forever, or how you could know that would be the case. And if it was a real life situation, torturing a child is a terrible thing to do, and why would you do it, and how could any good come from it? It's hard, impossible really, to imagine almost how it could. But if you really asked me to accept the hypothetical example that this will bring about peace on earth and no more children will ever be tortured, nor will they suffer from being bombed or shelled in cities elsewhere on the planet, or from cruelty from their parents or anything like that, then the utilitarian is going to say, look, I don't know if personally I ever could torture a small child to death, but if you could, and if that would achieve those consequences, that would be the right thing to do. Because after all, if you don't do it, there will be thousands, millions perhaps, of children who will get tortured to death or will die in extreme pain from violence all the time. We know that. It's happening right now, sadly, in Ukraine. The children are being shelled and dying. So if you could stop that by sacrificing one child, stop it forever, the utilitarian would say, yes, that is what you ought to do. So we don't accept those intuitive judgments as being a reliable guide, especially if we're talking about completely hypothetical scenarios, as we have here. And it's not only, by the way, Dostoevsky used this example. Some of you may be followers of the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin. One of her most famous stories, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelos, is essentially a rejigging of Dostoevsky's question there. in a more modern context, but still without any real explanation of how torturing a child is going to produce a utopian society, which is what she imagines. Okay, second objection, and I'm going to finish with this point. Many people say utilitarianism is just too demanding to be right, to be the right view, because it doesn't really distinguish between what we do and what we could do but fail to do. Remember the definition, you have to do what was the best of all the alternatives open to you. So, for example, suppose you're spending money on something that you are enjoying, that you like, but you could do something better with that money that is going to, from the point of view of the universe, do a lot more good. So here's an example. There's an organization called the Against Malaria Foundation. If you want to know more about it, you can go to the website that Claude mentioned. I think the full address, by the way, is thelifeyoucansave.org, and it recommends some effective charities. I'll be talking about this tomorrow. So the Against Malaria Foundation distributes bed nets against malaria. That's what's in these blue bags that the children are carrying on their head. And it's been well established that distributing bed nets in malaria-prone regions saves the lives of children. It's not just for the cost of a bed net. The bed net costs a couple of dollars, but if you have to distribute enough of them to be confident that you'll save the life of a child, and there's some cost in doing that, but good estimates suggest that maybe around $3,000, somewhere in the vicinity of $3,000 to $4,000 will save a child's life through distributing bed nets. So that's a good thing to do. But of course, there are other things that you could do with that money. If the other things that you could do with that money are not going to do as much good as saving the child's life, then utilitarianism says you should be donating it to the Against Malaria Foundation or to some other equally good charity if you can find one. So that's quite demanding, undoubtedly. And it says that most people are not living a fully ethical life. And I think that's true. I don't say that I'm living a fully ethical life. I know some people, very small number of people, who could claim that they're not spending anything on themselves beyond what's strictly necessary to continue to function in the world and to do good. But most of us, by that standard, are not living fully ethically. I think we can say that there are still degrees of how close you are to living an ethical life, and that's important to try to be working to the better end of the scale. But on the utilitarian view, it is something of a scale rather than just a black or white, right or wrong. So the question really is that I'm asking here is the problem with utilitarianism that we cannot accept a theory that has such demanding standards, or is the problem rather one with the state of the world today, where we have extremes of wealth and poverty? And I think that that really is the problem. And in fact, as we're here in Valletta, and I was taking a couple of photographs yesterday of the beautiful harbour you have here, I thought I'd give you one that I think shows the extremes quite well. I have no idea what this boat here is worth, but you can be sure it's in many millions of dollars, possibly tens of millions of dollars. I've read that some of the wealthy people who have boats like this they may be worth over $100 million, and they may cost something like $20 million a year to maintain and fuel. So, there is a serious question about whether people should be spending money on this when you think about the immense amount of good that money could do elsewhere in the world. So I will leave you with that question, and we still have a bit of time. not as much as I'd hoped for discussion before we break. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Ian, thank you for all the hard work you've done getting us here and all the help. Absolutely amazing place. First time in Malta and love it. So much pleasure, I tell you. I had ice creams today. We will talk about it. So, my talk will be about what is central to any ethical theory, that is axiology. Utilitarianism tells you to maximize the good, but of course the question is, what is the good? Yes? And I take it as a special aim of a philosopher, and believe me, we did our slides separately, but we end up in Sidgwick anyway. Mine is a bit older photo. And Sidgwick in the Methods of Ethics said that philosophers do something different than other people. And you can enumerate psychologists, sociologists, biologists, neuroscientists now. We are not so much interested in what is, but we are really interested in what should be. And it's especially, I think, interesting in the subject of the good and well-being, because usually you take well-being as something that is obvious, or that is just within us, or that you can observe or ask people about. And philosophers don't do that. Philosophers want to know, I mean, me and Peter and some others, the truth about well-being. So what is well-being? First of all, Thomas Scanlon, an American philosopher, made now quite a famous distinction that has been in philosophy for years, but now many people associate it with Scanlon, that when you talk about what there could be good, you can talk either about what is good to the world, so good in itself, or good as a whole, and you can talk about good for me and you and other sentient beings. So well-being is associated with the second one, yes? So it's good for me, which means that I am a type of creature that can not only reflect upon a good, but also experience it in a special way. Now, what are theories of well-being? In analytical tradition, usually we speak of three such theories. Desire-based theory, which says a good life means fulfillment of your desires. Perfectionism, a good life means working on perfecting your nature. And hedonism, a good life means being in a pleasurable state of consciousness. Each of the theory has its pros and cons, obviously, and advocates. I'm a hedonist. That's a confession. Take it as a confession. So I will talk today mostly about pleasure, but I will first try to show you very briefly why I believe that the first two theories are wrong. So a desire-based theory is a type of subjective theory about well-being, because usually it just says, well, the good consists in fulfillment of whatever desires you have. And that's, of course, a huge problem. Take a famous example of John Rawls and counting grass. Yes, so you may desire, you may really want to spend your whole life counting blades of grass. Well, if you want it, and I'm desire-based theorist, I should tell you that it's the right thing to do. That may mean that you will, for example, not fulfill all what you are good at. There was a question about being an artist and not being so good about being an artist. And Peter had his own answer, but I thought, well, maybe being an artist, if you know, for example, a pianist, yes? Being a pianist when you know that you don't play very well may be a kind of waste in your life. You may still want it, but maybe you would do much better if you do something else that you are really good at, right? Of course, for me, for a hedonist, the question would be how much pleasure you get from being a pianist or doing something else that you are really good at. Another problem with the desire-based theory is that you may get the good even if you don't know it. It's a famous Parfit's example about going on a train with a person who is severely ill, and you want this person to get better. You part, you never meet this person again, the person does get better, and it's wonderful, but how the good comes to you? Yes, your desire was satisfied, but you don't even know that. So yes, it is possible that only those desires that you do know about should be satisfied, and that's what good for you. I mean, your desires for this person to get better may be satisfied as well, but it may not just be good for you, it may be good for that person. So now the question is how long you should desire something. Let's say that my whole life I'm an atheist, and I desire that when I die, the funeral would be without a priest. Yes, it would be a non-religious ceremony. But, which probably sometimes happens at the deathbed, I'm so terrified that I suddenly desire to change my mind and to have a priest and to have a religious ceremony. Now the question is, should you, as for example my children, fulfill the desire that I had at the last moment for, let's say, a day or two, however long you think, or that I had for most of my life, for 40, 50 years? That's another problem with desire-based theories. Some theorists believe that it would be better to talk about the desires that we might have being rational beings. So there is this objective presumption that it's not just desires, it's the rational desires. That means desires that I would have if I had certain features. But as you can see, a subjective theory is turning now to an objective theory, because they may not be my true desires, but the desires that would be, for example, good for me to have. And that's about objective theory, the second theory, perfectionism, which can be viewed as an objectivist theory. That's another name for it. But this special part of objectivist theory, perfectionism, is interesting because it talks about your nature. So that is a very old thought, goes to Aristotle, and says you are a certain creature with certain characteristics, natural characteristics, and it's good for you to fulfill these characteristics and to have life that is in accordance with your nature. I think it's quite a nice theory, but now tell me why usually we talk only about those nice characteristics, like being a morally good person, or telling a truth, or being just, and not that about being aggressive or being mean, and so on. I mean, it's also in our nature. We just had this talk during our break. Then in our nature, there are many characteristics that makes our and others' lives quite bad. So this is one of the problems about perfectionism and objective theories, that even if you want to justify your choice, which nature, so which good things or virtues you want to maximize or bring about, you still have this problem of justification. The other problem, which I think is even more severe, is that you presume that something can be good for you, but you don't care for it. And it's something that Peter Railton said. If we, as in the beginning, we talked about things that are good for me, then it probably means that I need to care for them. That must be something that resonates with me, as Peter says. Yes? Otherwise, a theory would be quite paternalistic. So it's like parents who tells you, well, that's good for you, remember. And you say, I don't care. I don't want to be a doctor. And your parents would say, well, but it's so good for you. How something can be good for me if I don't want that? So if that's true, if things that are good for us must resonate with us in some way, then perfectionism and other objective lists is far away from that. Now, there is something in what I'm saying, because I want to say that hedonism is between those two theories. In a way, pleasure is something that you may not want. I may tell you, pleasure is good for you, so ice creams, other sweets, coffee, whatever you want, great sex, great literature, great film is really good for you. And you may say, no, it's not. But once you feel pleasure out of anything I enumerated or your own, you can't resist but think that pleasure is something good. And how it happens, that's the main part of my talk. So, well-being is pleasure. That's my family, great moment. That's a cake I made. I just can tell you that it looks much better than it tasted. And that's a part of Poland that we had a beautiful holidays at. What is pleasure? I'm really lucky working on pleasure because that's something that we all know about, right? If I tell you now to imagine pleasure that you had, you can easily do that. So let's do that. Remember pleasure that you remember. So think of pleasure that you remember. Now, I had those ice creams, but you may have something else. If you think carefully enough, you will feel pleasure. Is that right? It should be. It's, of course, of other intensity, probably, than the one you experienced, especially if pleasure was really great. But there will be something that still comes about the feeling and the experience you had. You may do that at home. That's a wonderful thing about pleasures, that if you remember them, they will bring the experience again and again and again. So, how did you know that it's pleasure? Philosophers ask what unites all those pleasures. Yes, what make a pleasure a pleasurable experience in a way? And there are two answers. They are different. pleasure as a feeling that we desire to have. So some philosophers say pleasure is an experience, I call it a feeling. So pleasure is a feeling that I know it's a pleasure because when I experience it, I want it to continue. Yes, so I think of that and it's yes, I want to have it again and again. Another possibility is that there is something in the feeling that is special. Yes? So it is the specific nature of pleasurable feeling that makes all other experiences pleasurable. There's quite a bit of a fight among philosophers here, which I think is completely unnecessary because we can show that those things to some extent go together. But let's first see what neuroscience have about pleasure. I think it's really good that within this topic it's so easy to use psychology and neuroscience and what we call descriptive science that can help philosophy and normative questions and ethics. So now neuroscientists define pleasure as a positive hedonic reaction. So imagine those pleasures that you had from, I don't know, doing sport, reading, having sex, eating something delicious. And if you think of those clusters of experiences, you will recognize that sometimes you feel pleasure that goes with it and sometimes not. So whatever you eat, for example, can be really good for you and nice in a way that will bring you pleasure, but sometimes you don't even notice anything, yes? So when you are very hungry, even simple potatoes would be delicious and bring you pleasure, but when you are full, we have this saying in Polish, leave the potatoes, eat meat, but of course not here. Eat potatoes, leave meat. Anyway, neuroscientists say that it's not eating that gives you pleasure, and these are not potatoes, and it's not a great book, but something within your mind that turns a simple experience into a pleasurable experience. I make this metaphor with sugar icing. So imagine that you put sugar icing on whatever experience you have. The sugar icing is pleasurable. That means that I make this differentiation between, for example, jogging and pleasurable jogging, because pleasurable jogging is the jogging with sugar icing. And you can do the same with anything else. That's the liking thing. Now, neuroscientists will tell you that liking is different from desiring. What it means? It means that to desire something and to find it pleasurable is different. There is a very famous experiment done in the 50s, I think, on rats. There was an equipment put into a rat's brain that was to move them toward pressing a button that would affect something in their brain that they thought would bring pleasure. But now they believe that it didn't bring pleasure, it brought the feeling of desiring something. We have this problem with addictions, yes? When you satisfy your addiction, it may not be that you feel pleasure with satisfaction, it may be that you just feel relief. Relief may be a type of pleasure, but sometimes it's clearly not, yes? It makes you feel relief, but the pleasure doesn't come. Anyway, if that's true, that liking is different from desiring, that, for example, those things happen in different parts of your brain, that means that the first one is not really right, yes? That what unites pleasures is not your desire, but the specific nature. Now, how can we use this knowledge? We thought that Sidgwick, so Peter and I thought that Sidgwick had it right, and that Sidgwick's definition that pleasure is a desirable state of consciousness is exactly right. Although, in our book, The Point of View of the Universe, we believe that a desirable means actually desired. And now, after a few years of further research, I don't believe it anymore. I believe that a desirable state means a state that is worthy of your desire. That means that it's not actually desired, but that you think that it is worthy of something of your attention. So I define pleasure as a feeling that when experienced by rational creatures, rational, I mean here that can use language, for example, that is a normative language, that I call something good, worthy, and so on. So that's rational creatures. It's liked, accepted, or treated as good. And that means that for me, pleasure is a kind of feeling that when you experience it, you think that it is good, that it's good to have it. And that unites all the pleasures. Why I believe it's a good definition? Because it uses desire, but not in a direct way. You make a judgment about what you should desire and not what you actually desire. Still, the feeling has the specific nature of your judgment. And of course, I limit myself here to rational creatures, as I said, because only rational creatures as us can use language with those words and then think of pleasure, so make the cognitive process available for this definition and for thinking of pleasure while experiencing it. Now, of course, hedonism has its own great objections, and that's one of it. Because hedonism is a theory of a state of mind, and it limits everything that is good to my state of mind. Then Robert Nozick came with this example of experience machine and asked people whether they would really want to limit their life to states of mind. I don't know whether you're familiar with Matrix. Still, okay. My children no longer. I had to push them toward this great film and great idea. Anyway, if you remember, imagine that you are in this machine. And Nozick says, would you agree to be plugged in a machine that would make you the most pleasurable state of mind possible? You would, once you are in a machine, you would not know that you are in it, but first you would need to make this act of accepting that you are getting to be plugged in. And Nozick thought that most of us would not want to get into the machine and be plugged in. So let's vote. Who would want to get into a machine that would give you the most pleasurable states of mind, but that would be only states of mind and not reality? Hands up, who goes for the machine? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You're making your mind. Good. Okay, 6 people, 7, well, perhaps. All right. That happens. That's a common response. Don't worry.
But do I know that it's going into the machine?
Once again.
Do I know that it's a machine? Just a machine?
Before you make a decision, yes. But once you are in a machine, no. It's like in Matrix, yes? So in Matrix, you didn't know that you are in Matrix. Okay. But now imagine that I'm giving you a pill. I'm this person who tells you, oh, ha, ha, it's not reality. You are in the machine already. Now, who wants to get out and live in reality? I can't tell you what the reality is, but I can tell you that your life is just a state of mind. Hands up who would want to get into reality. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Still not the majority. So who didn't want to get into machine, but now don't want to leave it? Hands up. All the rest, yes? Quite a lot. How come? How come? So it happens that it's probably not about reality and states of mind, but rather what Kahneman called a status quo bias. That means we simply like where we are. And that's quite a good news, isn't it? That we don't want the change. So when Nozick asked about the machine, the answer he got from us is not that I want my life to be so real, but I just like my life as it is. And for Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, you know, a great psychologist, that's a problem, because that means that economists, for example, cannot move us to change our life. Yes, so if they want, you know, a new phone program or TV program, and they call us and tell you, well, I have this wonderful new set for you. Would you want it? And we usually say, just leave me alone. Yes, I'm satisfied with what I have. That's exactly this. It's status quo bias. That's, I think, quite a good news for hedonists, because that reveals that the objective, objection that was supposed to be so big and terrible is no longer. That we need to find something else to object hedonism. I still have a few minutes. So I wanted to tell you why well-being should not be life satisfaction. I talk about it because that's what usually is checked when all the economists ask you whether you are satisfied with your life. Yes, so whether the well-being is checked by asking you whether you are satisfied with your life. Are you satisfied with your life, by the way? Hands up, who is? Yes, that's generally a good direction. We are mainly satisfied with our lives. But what's wrong with it? Scale, first of all, yes? So the questions are, how satisfied you are with your life, scale 1 to 10. Usually we choose 7, 8, right? 7, 8. 9, 10 is a bit too much. We worry. Yes, okay, I tell you, I'm so satisfied. 10. But something happens and I say, oh, I knew that, yes? And we very, very rarely go beyond 6 and 5. That must be a real tragedy in our life to give us so little points. So Daniel Kahneman made a few great experiments showing that we have many different cognitive biases about life satisfaction. For example, we believe that out of 2 scenarios, first, a daughter and a mother, a great life together for like 70 years. They quarrel in the 71st year, and then the mother gets very sick and dies. They never get together anymore. That's a bad ending. The second scenario, they quarreled for most of their lives. The 71st year, the mother gets ill, and they reunite. The mother dies in the daughter's arms. A happy ending. Which life is better? Usually people say the second, which is quite strange. Yes, so many years quarreling, and why do we believe that the second scenario is better? Because we love happy endings. That's one of the biases, and there are many more. Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was a great philosopher. Here he is. At his deathbed, he said, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Do you know what life he had? I wouldn't want my children to have such a life, even though Ludwig Wittgenstein was a great philosopher. Yes. Among many things, many bad things that happened to him, he had brothers who committed suicide. He had depression for most of his life, and he died quite young. What it means? It means that we may not judge our life in the best way, and the judgment may not be based on what really happened to us. And in case of Wittgenstein, I'm really happy for him. I have nothing against his judgment. It's wonderful that at his deathbed, he thought that he had a great life, because it's so much easier to die with this thought. But what does it say about the judgment of your life itself? And imagine the opposite. So imagine that you have quite a good life, nothing terrible happened to you, no death of children, no severe illnesses, no poverty, and you still believe that your life is bad. You're making a mistake in your judgment. I won't talk about psychology of that thing, but anyway, I just want to show or to put you into doubt about how important a judgment about your own life is. It may not be. And that's why I believe that it is better to measure our pleasures, our day-to-day pleasures. And that's actually what Kahneman does. There are some smart apps on your phone that you can install, and you will get questions from a few times a day, and they will ask you to measure your, they say, happiness, but for me it's just pleasure. So to measure your state of consciousness you have at the moment of receiving this question, from the point 1 to 10, or just there's an arrow between 2 points. And then to say in this app what you are actually doing. And after a few weeks, you get a description. I got through that. It was really interesting. I got through this experiment and this application a good few years ago, and I learned quite a few interesting things. One of them was, for example, that now then I had really young children, and being with my young children was actually not the most pleasurable thing I could experience. That was pretty shocking, I have to tell you. But I thought that it's good for me to learn what I find pleasure in. Yes? And by following it, you may then move towards a more conscious life, because you actually know what brings you pleasure. And it's not about, you know, judgment and life satisfaction and so on, but about real experiences that you go through every day. And because it's such a lovely practical thing, I just wanted to say a few coaching things. Oh, God forgive me. So I think we are animals, and because we are animals, we have body and we have others. And these are two main sources of our pleasure: movement and other creatures, not only people, but also animals. And because we are rational animals, we can think, be grateful, set ourselves an aim, and Peter talked about those aims a bit, and act ethically. And of course, for me and for Peter and for other philosophers, the last point is really interesting, because that motivates us toward being good and being sometimes even impartially good. And I will end up with a personal story. Just now a bit more than 2 months ago, a new war began, and maybe you know, we have over 3 million what we call guests, not refugees, but we call them guests, so Ukrainians who came, and there is a great need for housing and for places for them to stay. Just in Poland, imagine, yes, 3 million people in 2 months. And so we have an apartment, a spare apartment with my husband, and I talked to my husband very enthusiastically that we should give it to some Ukrainians. And my husband, who is a very good person, but also a bit less emotional than me, found quite a lot of problems. Yes, these are people we don't know, that's an old apartment that needs to be renovated, and so on and so forth. But we actually decided to do it. And we are having 3 very nice Ukrainian girls and a little boy in it. And my husband came to me a few days ago and said, "I'm so grateful to you that you pushed me towards it, because it feels so good when you help others." And that's the point. We all know that, yes? We all know that by nature, we are given this flood of pleasure in our brain when we help others. So why not do that, and why not use it? Thank you.